I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time, who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access. There were few minorities in sports media when Terence Moore began his career in the late 1970s. He helped to change that by paving the way for others with dignity, determination, and distinguished journalism. The National Association of Black Journalists once honored Terence for being the longest-running black sports columnist in the history of major newspapers. That was in 1999. Terence is still writing about sports and providing commentary on national and local TV, and I'm so happy that he's joining us as a guest from his home in Atlanta. Terence, it's an honor to have you on our show.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, it's great to be here, and I always like to talk to Ohio folks. I got that Ohio connection going.
That's right. And I'm talking about an honor because, think about this, Terence. You were once on the Oprah Winfrey Show.
Yes, indeed.
And now you're on Press Box Access. So, you either need a new agent or this is a testament to you being a super nice guy. And I know everybody knows you as a super nice guy, Terence.
Hey, you want to know, I mean no harm by this, Todd, but you do not look like Oprah. You kind of sound like her a little bit, but I mean, not really, but sounds
well,
like
I don't have as much money as Oprah, but,
I'm sure.
But this is great. Well, besides being a super nice guy, Terence, you've had an incredible career. Everybody knows you as a talented writer and a wise commentator, dating back since the late 1970s. I mean, you started out the Cincinnati Enquirer, you went on to the San Francisco Examiner, then spent 25 years as a general sports columnist at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And you're still cranking out columns, Terence. For the past decade, you've been doing the internet thing. It's amazing that you're still doing it.
Yeah, I'll tell you, my motto is anybody that pays me, I will work for them, provided that they are journalistically sound. I'm also a visiting professor of journalism at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, my alma mater, the good Miami, not the bad one down in Florida. And those are the type of things I teach my students too, is just to do what's right, what was taught years ago to me.
Well, you pay forward, as we say here in Ohio,
yes,
by teaching the students, and you've been a pioneer for African-American journalists in your field, and you're still writing great stuff, still appearing on television. You write for Forbes, CNN, MLB.com, you're NFL Network, ESPN, CNN, MSNBC. I mean, it goes on. Terence, you even have your own YouTube channel. Who in the hell does your taxes, Terence?
Yeah, those are the type of things you got to be careful about. But yeah, and I'll tell you, people ask all the time, well, when are you going to retire? When are you going to retire? And I always say, retire from what?
Right.
I mean, I've not worked a day in my life. I'd say somewhat, fun but I mean, as you know, this is work, but still, it's not like lifting things compared to what a lot of people do. It's been very enjoyable for me for all these 42 plus years as a professional sports journalist, and as long as it's enjoyable, hey, why do something else? Or just do nothing,
right?
For that matter.
30 Super Bowls, Terence. You covered 30 Super Bowls.
Yeah.
World Series, NBA Finals, Olympics, Final Fours, Indy 500, Daytona 500, and on and on and on. You were always a guy who was able to get close and get right there in the thick of the action. And I think about one night in particular in April 1985, and that's at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas.
Oh, yeah.
You covered the incredible middleweight championship bout between Marvin Hagler and Thomas Hearns. Where were you sitting that night, Terence?
Todd, I was literally, and this tells you the difference, okay? This would never, ever, ever happen anywhere close to this again. I was literally sitting right at ringside, right there. I was no more than maybe 6 feet away from the ring because, back in those days, they used to put us as close to the action as possible. And for the listeners who may not know, you had that horrific or terrific or whichever word you want to use first round where you had both of those guys just beating the snot out of each other, and it just went nonstop from the opening bell right to the end of that round. You had Hagler-Hearns just pounding each other, and we're right down the ringside just amazed. And I looked down at my shirt, and I had blood on my shirt.
Really?
Exactly. I mean, because it was just we're just so close, and often I think back, I could have done the Monica Lewinsky thing and just saved that for years. And heck, I'd be a millionaire right now, the blood from Hagler-Hearns.
So you were right there. Really, the first round is thought of as maybe the greatest round in boxing history.
Exactly.
How intense was it? It's so intense when you watch a video of it. What was it like to be sitting 6 feet away?
Here is the best way to describe it. And Todd, as you know, back in the days when we were like professional journalists, and not to say that doesn't exist today, but really back then, the protocol was for if you were a sports reporter, and it still is the same. You're in the press box, you're in a press setting like that, is to be sort of stoic and keep your mouth shut and just watch what's going on and just to observe. That is the first sporting event I ever covered where the sportswriter were going crazy.
Really?
And I just remember the guys all around, we were just standing up doing that first round, like, whoa, what's going on? And that was just unheard of back then, because that's when you just threw all of that stuff out the window. It was just so amazing. We were reacting like everybody else that this is like one of the greatest things we've ever seen.
You almost could feel the punches, it sounds like.
Oh, no, yeah, no doubt about it. So it was just surrealistic. And I'll tell you something else. You talk about Hagler. A couple years later, Hagler fought Leonard, Sugar Ray Leonard in Caesar's Palace, and Hagler lost, quote unquote. He actually won the fight, but they gave it to Leonard for a lot of reasons. And Hagler was very, very bitter for years. Matter of fact, he was so bitter, Hagler, he retired and to become an actor in Italy.
Right. He went
and
to
when
Italy,
he retired, no one thought he was going to retire for good, but he ended up doing it. But backtracking. So he loses that fight, theoretically. And again, it was at Caesar's Palace. And it was like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was just like walking through the parking lot. And I see this figure in this empty parking lot in the distance. And I was like, who is that? And, you get that reporter's instinct going, it's like, I'm just kind of curious. So I move closer and closer, and it's Hagler. Yeah, this is like hours. He's wandering the parking lot, wow. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, there's a story here. So I'm just like watching him and just wandering the parking lot. And then finally in the distance, there's this Budweiser truck. And there's a guy just unloading these cases of Budweiser. I guess they're taking the Caesar's Palace to one of the restaurants or what have you. And Hagler goes up to the guy and asks if he could have a beer.
Really?
And the guy looks at Hagler and says, oh, you can have the entire case. As if I saw the fight too. That was one of the most remarkable things I've ever witnessed as a sports journalist.
Did you go talk to Hagler at that time?
I did not, because this ties into, and probably people have heard this from time to time, that if you're from a broadcasting point of view, you have a great event, just let the event speak for itself. And that became very popular in the early 80s with Vin Scully. I remember that was one of those situations. Right. Sometimes nothing needs to be said. My thing was the just the scene itself was big enough. So describing all of that right there, that's a heck of a column.
Marvin Hagler died on March 13th, and
yes.
And a lot of great tributes to him, and it brought back a lot of memories. I was a big boxing fan, but I think this image of Hagler on that night is something that's going to stick with me, and I know it has stuck with you because I think it shows what these athletes, especially in boxing, what they put out there on the line, right?
Yeah, and I'll tell you something, Todd, and you can relate to this. I know. I learned something a long time ago in this business, that the better stories and the more emotional stories and the more gripping stories are the one of defeat instead of victory. And I want to tell you, when that really came to light, 1981, March of 1981, this was the NCAA tournament, and the Mark Aguirre DePaul team. Do you remember those college basketball teams?
Right.
It was considered a powerhouse in 1981. I believe they only lost one game going into the postseason season. They were just picked as a steamroll right through March Madness. And during that period, there was a stretch that started by UCLA in the 60s of you can just about tell who was going to win the national championship, because it was always like a dominant team. You had those UCLA teams. You had the Bobby Knight teams in 75 or 76 that went undefeated. You had the Kentucky team in 78. And so this was that team, that DePaul team in 1981. And their first game was at the Dayton Arena against a no-name team called St. Joe. Nobody had ever heard of St. Joe.
Yeah, from Philadelphia.
Team. Yeah. Right. And I'm covering it, just a nothing game, you figure. Well, St. Joe upsets them on a layup with no time left to win the game. And the thing that I'll never forget, that's one of the most amazing upsets I've ever seen, because it was just like a 5-second delay in the Dayton Arena, because everybody was like, oh, DePaul just lost. and then it's like this screaming, and the only first of all, you only hear the screaming and yelling from the St. Joe players, and then it's like the rest of the crowd. And I remember Mark Aguirre, the great Mark Aguirre, the guy who might have been Player of the Year that year.
I think he was, yeah.
Yeah, he just takes the basketball, throws it up in the middle of the air, and then catches it, and then runs out of the arena. And I was just thinking to myself, boy, this is a story here. And Malcolm Moran, who was a writer for the New York Times at the time, sitting to my right, I said, let's go follow him. So everybody else is concentrating on St. Joe in the upset, and Malcolm and I are running up the stands of the Dayton Arena on a snowy day, cold snowy day, watching Mark Aguirre run out the arena.
With the basketball, tears in his eyes, walking away from the arena. Wow. That was the story. Yeah. The story wasn't St. Joe. As far as I'm concerned, that was the story. I heard he went all the way to the team hotel, right?
He did. And we followed him most of the way. But then it got to the point where it's like, oh, geez, we got to go back and see, to what's going on in the arena. And so there was two, you had to make a choice at that point. There were two stories as far as I saw it. One story was to keep following him, which I could have easily done, or to do what I did. I got that part of the story and I went back. And I'm also glad I went back, because when I got back to the arena, I didn't go to the St. Joe locker room, because that to me, again, wasn't a story. I went to the DePaul locker room, because that was a story. So I get to the DePaul locker room, and Ray Meyer, who was the legendary coach of DePaul, he was about 150 years old at the time. He's outside the locker room door, and I have never seen anybody this pale in my life. I thought, and Todd, I kid you not, I thought he was going to die. He was like leaning against the wall, his hair just all frazzled, and he just like, it's almost like it was hyperventilating, and there's a group of us around him almost embarrassed to ask him a question. We feel so sorry for him. That was the scene. And certainly from a columnist standpoint, you didn't really have to ask anything, although people ended up asking. But to me, my column at that point was everything that I just saw.
Right. And that's what I mean by, like, even the biggest events, you were able to find a way to get right there in the thick of it, whether it's blood flying in the front row at Hagler-Hearns, seeing Hagler in the parking lot at 3 a.m. asking for a beer, or seeing Ray Meyer, just devastated in the hallway after a monumental upset. You were there. You were right there in the moment and captured it. And I think that's something you did so well. I spent a lot of time wandering aimlessly like Hagler. And here's an example, Terence. Here's an example. You and I covered the same event, the 1993, the game of the century.
Oh, yeah.
Florida's #1 Florida State college football game at Notre Dame. I'm just a dumb kid who covered the game. You had much better access than me. Tell us about that.
Well, let me set this up, Todd. I was born and raised in South Bend, Indiana, home of the University of Notre Dame. And I admit it, I've got blue and gold in the blood. And let me tell you something here today, that dirty little secret here. I tell my students this all the time. There's no such thing as objective journalism, because we're all subjective, because we all have backgrounds. Your objective to be as least subjective as possible, okay, and realize where your biases are. And Lou Holtz, I was the first person to interview Lou Holtz when he became coach at the University of Notre Dame back in 1986. But anyway, the game of the century, 1993, you had #1 Florida State against #2 Notre Dame, South Bend, Indiana, in November 13th, 1993, as a matter of fact.
Just a gray, cold college football day,
Perfect Newt Rockne, Gipper, kick him in the butt day. Particularly since Notre Dame won. But anyway, what was interesting before this is one of my all-time biggest thrills. I get a call on that Wednesday from John Heisler, who was a great sports information director of Notre Dame for years. I love John Heisler. And he said that, hey, Lou was inviting you and a few other guys over to the house for a barbecue. And I'm thinking, okay, I mean, when is this? Like in June, July? Before
Right,
July,
what are we talking here? Right.
Yeah, and he said, tomorrow. I'm like, you kidding me? You're kidding me. Again, let's let the readers know that college coaches are the most paranoid people on the face of the earth, okay? Well, next to college basketball coaches. And there's no way, once you get to Wednesday, these guys are in a total blackout for the rest of the week until the game time, all right? Everybody. Right. They don't even want to talk to their wife or their kids.
Right?
So just imagine this. So this guy's telling me that he wants me and some others to come to his house on Thursday. Let me see, Friday, Saturday. That's 3 days before the game of the century to have dinner. I mean, it's insane. And I tell you, so that was true. You get there, and Lou and his late wife, they're there, and as gracious hosts, as if, they're like the next door neighbors. There's like a little game coming up on Saturday. I mean, it was just
only the game of the century, Terence.
Only the game of the century. It was just unbelievable. The food was pretty good too.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, how was the barbecue?
Oh, it was good. It was very good. I mean, Lou fixed the ribs himself. Not really, but that's my story. But that's something I never will forget. And I remember at the end of the day, at least for me, the end of the night, I was leaving, and and again, they were just like gracious hosts, and Lou's leading me out the door, and I'm standing at the door, and I said, well, Lou, I said, good luck to you guys on Saturday. And he said, well, I think we're going to win. Okay. And they said, we're going to give it our best shot. Of course, they didn't win the game dramatically. But that was in my top 5 favorite moments as a sports journalist.
Well, I mean, let's think about this. They did win.
Yes.
I was at the press box writing a story. You're still wiping the barbecue sauce off from having dinner with the coach. That's the kind of access you got, Terence, and the kind that I was always wandering around aimlessly looking for.
Coming up on 5 Minute News, I'm Anthony Davis. You might think it's partisan because maybe it's critical of one side or the other, but it's not. It's just the truth. And I think that's also something that's kind of unusual for Americans listening to the radio or to podcasts, because the news landscape in the States has been so partisan for so many decades. So 5 Minute News is verified, truthful, independent, unbiased, and essential world news daily.
Well, Lou Holtz was quite a character. I mean, he had, the quips and the one-liners, and Lou was something. He was also a guy that saw the humor in sports, and not everybody is that way. There are some maniacal characters too, and you have met quite a few. I know during your time working in San Francisco, you had a few. I mean, let's think about it. You covered the Niners, the Raiders, the A's,
yes,
and the Giants. And you had some Raiders. One that comes to mind was John Matuzak, the Tooz. He actually was in the movie Caveman, Yeah. So you had a little run-in.
And also the longest yard, or the last yard. What's the thing? Is the longest yard or the last yard, or something like
longest
that?
Longest
yard, yeah.
Right. But you actually witnessed John Matuzak in one of his great moments of maniacal behavior. Tell us about that.
Well, there were more than a few, but one of the most striking ones was, it was like in the early 80s, and I'm covering them. And that was a wild and crazy team, to say the least. They were very good. But Lester Hayes, the great cornerback, used to tell me, he says, you know what? He says, we work hard and we play hard. That's an understatement. But anyway, we're walking out of the practice facility one day up in Alameda, and John Matuzak was quote playing around with one of his teammates, and told his teammate that he was going to give him a head start. And I'm right behind the teammate that he's referring to, and I'm thinking, so what does this mean? And the guy was saying, "Stop playing, John, stop playing." And so all of a sudden, John pulls out a Magnum and points it at a stop sign in the distance and just blows off the top of the head of the stop sign. And yes, his teammates started running. And I started running the other way like, this guy is nuts. So
He wasn't the only one on the team carrying a gun.
No.
Well, it must have been something about Oakland, because there were a few other people in Oakland in that time when you were covering sports.
Yeah.
One of them was Billy Martin.
Oh boy.
Who really was known as a 5-time or 6-time manager of the New York Yankees. He was like a Spinal Tap drummer. They kept blowing him up and he'd come back. But Billy was actually managing the A's when you covered that team. I think there was a moment when you met Billy or in his manager's office, and they weren't sharing food then, were they?
The only problem I had with Billy Martin, I'm going to get to the story you're talking about here in a minute. The only problem I had with Billy Martin was, and Billy Martin was, I guess now they would call it attention deficit or whatever. I just call it crazy. He was crazy. He was nuts, and particularly after losses. All right, I mean, he was just bad after. I mean, he was just despondent. And so there's one particular loss, Steve McCaddy, the starting pitcher, had a bad game, and I worked for the San Francisco Examiner, the evening newspaper. So I usually would kind of come in late to kind of get a secondary type of story angle. So I go into Billy's office. He's sitting down behind his desk, and this is after he held this joint press conference with other writers. And I said, Billy, so I guess Steve just didn't have it today. Billy just literally jumps over his desk. His desk. I'm sitting at a couch in front of him, and he stands in front of me and just starts spitting and yelling, talking about fastball. I told him to fastball. Because there were some other adjectives in between them. But anyway, I just had to get that straight off my chest. But anyway, the story you're referring to was, it's like 1983. Billy had signed a contract, but the year before with the A's. And he wanted to renegotiate the contract, and the A's wouldn't do it. So it was after a game, and we get to the to his manager's office, and Billy's not in his office, but the office door is open, and it's just torn apart. I mean, there's holes in the wall. I mean, it's almost like Michael Myers from Halloween. You remember the horror guy? It was like he had his knife.
Hold on a second. You got Lon Chaney and you got Michael Myers.
Yeah, it was like he had taken his knife and just turn up pictures and it was a mess. And then, of course, everybody knew what happened. Billy had just torn up his office because he was so upset they didn't get this contract renegotiated. And, of course, he gets fired soon afterward for like the 20th time in his career.
Right.
So, anyway, it's the year after that. I'm at Yankee Stadium covering a Yankee game, and Art Fowler, who was Billy's drinking partner, actually it was a pitching coach disguised as a drinking partner.
That was the way it was, right? The manager would have a so-called, coach on the staff who basically was just out to, buy the drinks and drink with them.
Yeah, you know how that goes. And Art Fowler was that guy for Billy. Okay. Good old boy, Art Fowler. I think it was from North Carolina. But anyway, so I'm at Yankee Stadium in the dugout, and batting practice is going on, and I see somebody waving at me in right field. Again, this is the kind of stuff that doesn't happen anymore, by the way. Somebody's like waving at me to come over, And I knew some Yankees back then, like Reggie Jackson, for instance. He and I have always been pretty close. But it wasn't Reggie Jackson because this guy was a little lighter than Reggie Jackson. Okay, so I'm looking up there, and I'm just like looking around, and so I start getting close to the outfield, and it's Art Fowler, the pitch coach. He was a pitching coach with Billy in Oakland. Everywhere Billy goes, he was a pitching coach. And he was now the pitching coach for Billy with the Yankees. And with the A's, I had talked to him a few times. Nice, good old boy for the most part. So he called me out to the outfield, and I'm sitting in the outfield doing batting practice. And he says, hey, you remember about Billy's office being torn up last year? I said, yeah. He said, Billy didn't do that. I said, really? He said, that was done by Cleet. He's talking about Cleet Boyer. Cleet Boyer, who was Billy's third base coach. He said, yeah, Cleet did it.
He was blaming somebody else?
Yeah, right. He was blaming Cleet Boyer on the. So he's throwing Cleet Boyer under the bus because he and Billy had a falling out. Cleet Boyer, the old Yankee, and of course Billy Martin, the old Yankee, whatever. So it was great for me because it was a front page story for the San Francisco Examiner, that next day, and the front page, Art Fowler talking about billions, that kind of stuff. So again, those are the type of things that we can't do anymore. Have somebody call you in the outfield. First of all, you're not going to get close to being on the field at any time.
Right. Well, Terence, you seem to have a calming effect on a lot of notable hotheads.
I'll tell you this quick story about how I first met Woody Hayes. I'm up at this is after he had punched the Clemson player in December 78 rather, at the during the Gator Bowl. And it's about 6 or 7 months later, I'm up in Columbus, Ohio, and I turn a corner of a particular building, and I literally bump into Woody Hayes. I mean, just almost knocked him over. And I apologized, and he asked my name. So I said, Terry Moore. And he said, "Oh, you're the old center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals." I had no idea what he was talking about. I was going to roll with it, And we just, it was pretty good. And I said, "Well, hey, you got 5 minutes to talk, coach?" He said, "Sure." And I said, "Well, I need to let you know that I'm a reporter for the Cincinnati Enquirer." And he kind of got tight-lipped, tight-faced and everything. Said, "You asked for 5 minutes, I'll give you 5 minutes." And it was exactly 5 minutes he gave me before he said, "All right, your time's up." But when I told him I was from, went to Miami, Ohio, I was like, oh. So from that point on, that was in 1979, May of 79, we had a pretty good relationship. But getting to the phone call. So I'm covering the Indianapolis 500. This is like in the mid-'80s. And I called up Woody, and I told him, hey, I'd like to come and interview you in Columbus for, just do a story with you. He said, "Sure, we'll have lunch. Come on up." And so it's that Sunday of the Indianapolis 500. And Todd, as you know, there's this weird humor when it comes to us as sports journalists. And my colleagues, some of my colleagues are kidding me, saying that this interview is never going to happen. Woody's going to die before the interview. Just funning around,
Right.
And so anyway, it's that Monday, or that Sunday night rather, and word comes out that Woody had a stroke or something of that nature. And in Ohio, back in Columbus, there goes that interview. Next day, I'm getting ready to leave my hotel room. The phone rings. I pick up the phone, and this is back in the old days when you can tell long distance, you get that long distance kind of haze in the background, blah, blah, blah. And this woman said, "Hello." She says, "This is so-and-so of the Ohio State Hospital." I'm like, okay, I don't know where this is going. And she says, "Could you hold the phone for Coach Hayes?" I'm like, this has got to be a joke. So I wait a few seconds, and the voice on the other end says, "Hello, is this Terry?" I said, yes. It's Terry, this is Coach Hayes. I want to apologize for getting sick on you. Can we reschedule?
That's incredible.
It really was. I've written about that several times, but I'm telling you, that's the side of Woody Hayes that people don't see.
Amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, it really, really was. That was just one of the most fascinating things I've ever encountered. And, of course, that was the last time I ever talked to Woody Hayes because he died about a year or so after that, or within that year, perhaps. I was at his funeral, though. It was held up at Upper Arlington, Ohio. And that was one of the most interesting funerals I ever covered. I was one of the few reporters that was allowed there. They didn't have very many reporters, and you had to sit up in the balcony. And they had the stipulation that you could not bring in any electronic devices. So I brought in some electronic devices.
Oh, Terence.
Don't tell anybody.
No, we're not telling anybody. Don't worry.
And you know what? I can't find that microcassette tape to this day.
No.
I put it somewhere, and what it was Woody saying, "They told you not to do it." This is Woody telling me, "This is what you get, young man."
This is for breaking the rules, Terence.
Exactly.
Well, you broke the rules that day, but you also broke down a lot of barriers for African-American journalists. I mean, when you came through in the late 70s, it was pretty much mostly white people in the press box. And I was always been curious about what it was like for you to be a pioneer in that setting. How were you received when you started out as a professional journalist in the late 70s?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. And there was good and bad. The good was I started out at the Cincinnati Enquirer and it was fantastic there. I had no problems at the Inquirer, and just had so many great guys. Boy, they were like, it was old time newspapers, and that part of it was good. But at the same time, you could feel the friction because I had two things going against me. Not only being a black reporter, I was the first black sports writer in the history of the Cincinnati Enquirer, which has been around since 1840. I was only the second black writer in the history of the Cincinnati Enquirer, period, of any kind.
Wow.
And I ended up being only the second black person ever to cover Major League Baseball on a regular basis. And when I covered San Francisco Giants, I was the first black person ever to cover the National Football League on a regular basis for a major metropolitan newspaper. When I covered the Raiders, first black columnist in the history of the South. Columnist, for people who don't know, that means I was the first black person allowed to write his opinion about sports. Right. I made a newspaper. And currently I'm the longest running black sports columnist of major newspaper in history.
Yeah, the National Association of Black Journalists, they in 1999, they honored you.
Yes.
Saying you were the longest running black sports columnist in the history of major newspapers.
And I went on for another amazing 10 consecutive years. That's never going to be broken because, as you know, the way newspapers are declining, that's not going to happen. And there aren't virtually no or very few black sports journalists, columnists now. But go back to answer your question, there were knuckleheads, no doubt about it, here and there. I could just remember the first of the worst I had was my second year at the Cincinnati Enquirer, and I was the backup guy on the Big Red Machine. And I was actually given the beat. The guy named Ray Buck was the beat writer, and Ray was always great with me. And so the first series, they were playing the Giants opening, ironically, because I ended up covering the Giants the next year. The first series was against the Giants opening day, and you know how big opening day is in Cincinnati. And so Ray was going to cover that first series, and I was going to take the next series. But Ray got sick before the second game of the season, and said, "Well, you got to cover for me." And boy, you're talking about tension. And this was back during the days when you had 10,000 people covering the Reds because there's a Big Red Machine. Newspapers were at their heyday, so it was a packed press box. They say I'm the only black person that's there, and then it's the second game of the season, and you know how that worked back then. You got to write 2 stories before the game. You got to write the running and notes and everything. So I'm under all this tension just to get all that done. So I'm sitting in the press box, and it's like they played 8:00 games back then, and it's like 20 minutes before game time, and I'm feeling pretty good because I just got in my last pregame story. And one particular writer who comes over and stands next to me and looks around the press box, and then all of a sudden I just noticed it was very quiet. So it was like this was a setup, spoiler alert. And then the writer says, "So where's Ray Buck today?" And somebody to my right, a couple of places to my right says, "Oh, he's off today." Then the writer standing next to me says, "Well, who's going to cover for the Enquirer today?"
Oh. And
then somebody in the back says, "Terry Moore." And then the writer standing next to me said, "Oh, this ought to be effing interesting."
Oh.
And then they started laughing, just laugh. People just started laughing. There is a guy named Meyer for the Dayton Journal-Herald, and I'm so embarrassed. I should know this guy.
I think it was Paul Meyer.
Paul Meyer.
Yes.
I should remember his name forever because Paul Meyer, not only because of what I'm going to tell you, but because I talked to Paul Meyer many times through the years.
Yeah,
Paul Meyer gets up from his seat, comes over, puts his arm around me, and this was similar to what happened in 1947 with Pee Wee Reese and Jackie Robinson when Jackie Robinson was being heckled in Cincinnati, ironically. Okay. Paul Meyer puts his arm around me and says, "Don't let the bastards get you down.
Wow.
If you ever need anything, let me know."
Oh, good for him.
I always remember that. So
wow.
There were a lot of those type of incidents. There were always these little things, little jabs, but if you put them all together, they were pretty significant. And if you weren't a strong enough person, they could have been very detrimental, particularly being a Jackie Robinson. I was a Jackie Robinson, and I have been a Jackie Robinson, a black journalist.
Well, when you left San Francisco in late 1984 to go to Atlanta, where you still live, I mean, you end up spending 25 years working for the Journal-Constitution. You went as a sports columnist, and like you said, you're writing your opinion.
Right.
And you're in the deep South. I mean, all sports writers have to have tough skin. We all used to get like nasty letters and comments. I never had to deal with the racial stuff. How did you handle those attacks? How did you handle that in your career as a columnist in the Deep South?
First of all, it was pure hell. And for me to look back and see that I survived 25 years, and it was nonstop, it was a miracle. And the first part of your question is, being a Christian, being a spiritual person, that right there was a huge part of why I was able to survive. No question about it. The other reason I was able to survive was right from the get-go, I had some very great support from some legendary guys. The first week I was at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the first call I got was from a guy named Andrew Young.
Oh, wow. And
Andrew Young was the second black mayor in history of Atlanta. Andrew Young was a former UN ambassador to the United States, former congressman, and most importantly, he was a lieutenant under Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Right.
One of the second calls I got was from Maynard Jackson. Maynard Jackson was the first black mayor in Atlanta, one of the first black mayors in the history of this country. And so I had the civil rights icons that were helping me. Hank Aaron, who I became very close with, he was a very supportive. So I had people along those lines that were very helpful. And then I also had the other thing, the background of having worked in San Francisco for 5 years and Cincinnati for three years, where I had basically this resume of competence. So the problem that they had and the problems I were having were not only outside the paper, but also inside the paper. It was a whole other story. But there was a dilemma that they faced. They could not say that I was incompetent because I won too many awards nationally and locally, even before I got there.
Right.
So the only thing that they could do, when I say they, I'm talking about all of them, the only thing that they could do was try to terrorize me to the best of their ability to hope that I would leave, which I was not going to do, because I felt that it was my responsibility as a Jackie Robinson in the business to make it work. And that's what I did. But it was not easy.
What did they do, Terence? What was the worst?
There are so many worst. I can't describe them. And there was sabotage. I had people sabotage things that I was doing. And I don't want to get into any detail about that right now, but trying to ruin my career with different things. And luckily, there were enough people that I had dealt with in the business through the years that understood what was going on. So that was very helpful. It was tough. I mean, and I want to tell you one thing, too, to balance this out. I somewhat expected some of the issues I would have with whites when I came to the South, giving my opinion, but it was way worse than I could have possibly imagined. I will give you an example in a minute, but I'll tell you where I'm going with this. But what I did not respect was some of the resistance I got from black people, because I discovered, being a guy that grew up in the Midwest, there was sort of like a slave mentality that was going on. I remember the first few weeks I came to town, and I've always had the same writing style. And my writing style is very direct. I give my opinion, and then I support what I'm going to say, which was unusual here in the South, black or white, and to be a black person giving a direct opinion, it was a little dicey. So I would be in a restaurant or barbershop, and black people would come up to me saying that, I see what you're writing, man. You're going to get us all shot. Where they were almost offended that I was writing tough things. So I was kind of getting it from both sides there. I had people coming up that would just yell at me on the street about what I was writing. They would drive by in cars yelling things. I would have, when I first started in Atlanta in the 80s, there wasn't sports talk radio. That hadn't been big then, but talk radio was still big. You just had the news talk radio shows. So it was routine for the talk radio people to devote an entire day's show to Terence Moore, that black guy for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, writing all this racist stuff. And racist stuff to them was me having the audacity to give my opinion.
Wow.
And just talking about having him fired and stuff. It was just, it was rough.
And yet you kept going. That's what's amazing. I mean,
Yes.
I mean, besides being a great guy and being so talented, to have the persistence and the determination and the strength to do your job the way you did it all those years, it's just so admirable. I've always wanted to tell you that.
Well, I certainly appreciate that.
Well, you certainly broke down the barriers and paved the way for so many, young journalists now. Thankfully, we do have a much more diversified media. We do have the perspectives of African-American journalists and others, non-white. And I think a lot of that just goes back to the toughness that you had. And, you mentioned a guy who supported you from the get-go in Atlanta. And he's a guy who also could relate to some of what you were dealing with, and that's Henry Aaron.
Yes.
And Hank, Hank died on January 22nd. And again, a lot of great tributes, but you knew Henry Aaron way beyond, the tributes. You knew what he dealt with, especially in 1974 when he was on the way to breaking Babe Ruth, when he did break Babe Ruth's home run record. But you got to talk to Aaron many, many times over the last 40 years. Tell us about your relationship with Henry Aaron and why that was so special.
Well, and again, not to bury the lead, I'll just get right to it. One of the biggest thrills I had, which was an unfortunate thrill, and maybe thrill is not the right word, I should say honor, was the day that Hank died. I got a call from Billy Aaron, his widow, who asked me to be one of his honorary pallbearers. So I go from that to being a person who talked to Hank Aaron more than any sports journalist in history to being his honorary pallbearer. That was just fascinating. And we had a very good relationship. I mean, he'd call me up and I'll tell you this, Todd, during the Barry Bonds situation, for instance, he wanted nothing to do with that. Mm-hmm. And so I became his designated spokesperson, and everybody knew it. I mean, to be clear,
we're talking about the whole steroid angle, that story, and Aaron really, like you said, stayed away from commenting about that.
That's exactly right. So, matter of fact, and I can't think of his name, but one of the legendary writers for Sports Illustrated wanted to do a story with Hank Aaron about Barry Bonds. Couldn't get Hank because Hank was just dodging it. So he ended up talking to me about Hank and what he thought about Barry Bonds. So it was like that. And so this went on for like a whole year or so. So whenever I would appear on television, ESPN or CNN or whatever, Hank would call me up or I'll call up Hank, and Hank would like laugh like, "Hey, I saw you." Yeah, you did a good job. Yeah, that's what I would have said. Yep. Yeah. So that's the kind of relationship we had.
What did you respect most about Aaron?
Well, what I respected most about Aaron was, and we were alike in so many ways, which is why we got along very well. He was a man of deep convictions. And because of those deep convictions, a lot of people sort of misunderstood what he was all about. And what I meant by that is I've written columns about this since his death. People are trying to rewrite history now. And I find it offensive because they're trying to make it seem like, okay, was Hank Aaron a nice guy? Oh, no doubt about it. Was he soft-spoken? Yeah, he was. Was he a guy that smiled a lot? Yeah, that he was all that. But you know what? He was tough as nails. Mm. And when he had something to say, particularly when it came to racism and baseball, racism in general, he said it boldly and loudly, okay? And now what's happened over the last few years, people are trying to make it seem like, oh, he was like this docile guy and so on and so forth. But they don't remember, because I was there, because usually when he would blast baseball or society, I was a person that would be a spokesperson or get it out there, either in print or on the airways. He was being ripped like crazy by people, okay? Fans in general, the media, some of the same writers talking about, oh, well, Hank was such a nice guy. Well, you weren't saying that 10 or 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I call it the Muhammad Ali thing. And I've written about this before too. Muhammad Ali was a guy that during the last 15 to 20 years of his life, it was like, oh, what a great guy, blah, blah, blah. People want to pose with him, and particularly white folks. You know, they looked at him as being this, oh, he's such a great guy, so on and so forth. So wait a minute now. I'm old enough to remember when I was growing up, because I grew up in mostly white schools, hearing white folks call this guy everything but the son of God. They hated this guy, okay? Right. And all the way through. So what was the difference? What happened with Hank and what happened with Muhammad Ali? It was very simple. What happened was when they, and this happens with a lot of black people in general, unfortunately, once you become harmless in the eyes of certain whites, then it becomes fashionable to rally around them. Once Muhammad Ali was unable to basically speak, he had the Parkinson's disease, and he was just like marked for the cameras. Like, you know, once he became that Muhammad Ali, then all of a sudden he's a great guy. Okay. Once Hank never became feeble per se, but once Hank was sort of out of the spotlight that he was before in his earlier days with the Braves, and they just saw him smiling or throwing out the first pitches at games or waving from the owner's box or what have you, then that became the Hank Aaron that they wanted to remember for the rest of their life. And one more thing along Hank Aaron's line. Hank, and I've written this many times before, Hank Aaron, his idol was Jackie Robinson. And Jackie Robinson, everybody thinks about April 15th, 1947, and they forget about the rest of Jackie Robinson. Right. Jackie Robinson was LeBron James way before LeBron James. He would talk about outspoken. Oh, my goodness. I mean, he marched with Dr. King. He spoke out against injustices. His last speech, Jackie Robinson, I'm a Jackie Robinson enthusiast, as you can tell. His last speech, October 1972, before Game 2 of the 1972 World Series in Cincinnati, baseball thought they were doing Jackie Robinson a favor by honoring him, you know, because it was one of the anniversaries, maybe I can't do math that fast, 25th anniversary, I guess, of him breaking the color barrier. And so instead of giving this nice farewell to baseball speech in something like 35 seconds, Jackie rips baseball for not having a black manager up to that point and not having a black third base coach, which would lead to being a black manager. I mention that because a couple of weeks after that, Jackie Robinson died. Yeah. And that's when Hank Aaron said, you know what? I am going to take over for Jackie Robinson. I am going to be the guy that speaks out like Jackie Robinson did. And that is exactly what Hank Aaron did. And he did it forever. And people disliked him strongly for that.
He was like the conscience of the game.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. Hey, Todd, I can tell you're a columnist. That's a good phrase. I like that. I'm going to steal that. That's good. You're right.
That's all right. That's all right. You know, I mean, the tape recorder won't work, right? You'll lose the cassette.
Exactly.
Well, Terence, Jackie Robinson, Hank Aaron, they did yeoman's work, paving the way in athletics, and you did the same in sports journalism. And I mean that wholeheartedly.
Well, thank you.
I mean, your career has been amazing, 40 plus years. You're still writing great stuff. You're still on television. You have the highest rated local TV sports show in Atlanta on the ABC affiliate every Sunday night. I mean, Terence, you're like an amazing industry of yourself. You know, it's like you should just have a big satellite dish and walk around. But what I mean by this is it's an honor really to have you on this show. I know how busy you are, and to grant us the time and the perspective has been a real treat. I've really enjoyed this. Thanks for listening to Press Box Access. You can find us here with a new episode every other Wednesday. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. Drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcomed here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcast. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Sarah Wilgrube, and our audio engineer Dave Douglas. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
Hi, podcast listeners. I'm Carol Costello, a former CNN anchor and national correspondent. This January, I'm launching a podcast about one of the first cases I ever covered as a journalist. It's one that stuck with me all of these years, the one that buried itself under my skin and stayed put. It's a true crime series about an amazing woman named Phyllis Cottle who defied torture and death and brought a fierce rage to the quest to find her attacker. Carol Costello presents Blind Rage. It's a production of Evergreen Podcasts and signature title of the Killer Podcast Network. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Discover more great true crime and paranormal programming at killerpodcast.com.